Today I welcome back now partner Mike DeBernardis from the Hughes Hubbard firm. We take a look at his thoughts on regulatory enforcement and oversight in 2021 and going forward.
This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and I'm extraordinarily pleased to have now partner Mike DeBernardis at Hughes Hubbard join me for our quarterly review. Typically, we take a look at the past 3 months in the FCPA realm, but there's been really a dearth of FCPA cases. So I asked Mike if we could maybe expand out a little bit and talk about some other areas of his white-collar practice, and more importantly, what his clients might be interested in hearing about. So, Mike, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome, and thanks so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
You know, Tom, when you're talking about me, the introduction never seems long-winded. So I appreciate it. No, I'm happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Maybe I'd start with what are some of the top 3 areas that either you or the firm or your section are really counseling clients to be aware of under the new Biden administration for the next few years?
And sort of going back to the FCPA is not going anywhere. I know Q1 has started pretty slow. We've had 15 years plus of solid FCPA enforcement. And I think a 3-month period is just too short to make any sort of judgments on. I really, I think it's the lack of major cases is a product of, change in administration, new people coming in. There was a bunch of flurry of activity at the end of 2020. So we're really not reading anything into that. And we really are counseling clients to be very, cautious about the FCPA. I think the Biden administration is fully committed to continuing aggressive enforcement of the FCPA. The leadership he's put in place it appears very committed. And I really think what we're warning clients about is as we start to come out of this pandemic and people get vaccinated and we get people back in the offices and really start to travel again, we could see an explosion of enforcement activity from cases that have sort of been progressed as far as they can be progressed, without traveling and going on site to places. We've had now more than a year of a remote work environment where it has been far more difficult for compliance personnel to monitor and to sort of keep tabs on their people, and a lot of financial pressures at many companies that came along with the economic impact of the pandemic, and all of that is really a perfect storm for FCPA issues and enforcement. So, really looking probably towards the second half of this year for that to pick up a lot. The second area is more traditional SEC enforcement, accounting, fraud, insider trading, and those types of things. I think part of that comes with a new leadership there that is we expect to take a more aggressive enforcement approach. And part of it also relates back, as everything does these days, to the pandemic. And I think, at least initially, we're counseling clients. You're going to see some activity around statements made during the pandemic about financial health, accounting practices during the pandemic, how different things have been accounted for, loans, that sort of thing. I think the SEC will be busy on those issues, at least initially. And the third area I think really to look out for, and we're counseling clients on, is the area of sanctions and sanctions violations and evasion. Biden, at least so far, appears to be willing to use economic sanctions and some of these other tools, such as the entity list, in a similar manner as the Trump administration. That really comes into play when they're dealing with Russia or China and these entities. What that means is the lists are constantly changing, and there's going to be regular attention because those lists are only as valuable as the enforcement of them is. So for companies that are dealing with entities in China or Russia regularly or even irregularly, you've got to be vigilant about keeping a close eye on the different lists and what restrictions might be in place. Because I think we'll see regular and continued enforcement in that space. And then if I can cheat a little bit and just add a quick note on one other thing, and that's cybersecurity, I think has become just such a hot topic issue. It is not an area that I focus on, but I feel like that's an area we're getting more and more questions from clients and passing them on to colleagues. And I think the interesting thing about cybersecurity, when you talk cybersecurity investigations, enforcement, is that it could come from many different places. The SEC has a task group, working group focused on it. You can see it coming from other agencies, the FTC, the FCC. So it really can come from a lot of places. But that's an area I know that clients are very concerned about.
In addition to the areas that you've talked about, Mike, I've also read and seen lots of announcements from other federal agencies that indicate that they may be taking a more aggressive stance. And I specifically point to the FTC or Federal Trade Commission, the CFPB, the CFTC, where I think the new administration has made clear that they will have more robust enforcement. But maybe start with the FTC because they seem to be indicating they're going to take a much more aggressive stance in antitrust and anti-competitiveness. I see that as almost a direct tie to the FCPA. But how are you counseling clients around these agencies that may ramp up their oversight and enforcement?
If we talk generalities first, I think you're spot on. It was the last 4 years have been unique for a lot of people who work in enforcement at these agencies. You had an administration who was explicitly de-emphasizing enforcement. And so, you can imagine that creates a very interesting situation if you're, an investigator at the CFPB or the FTC or whatever it may be. And we're coming out of that now, and you're absolutely right. Everything we hear is this is going to be, we're going to go back towards Obama era enforcement policies with respect to these agencies. So, I'm not an antitrust expert, but we have certainly been getting questions and talking to people about, the FTC, at least we believe, is sort of taking an expansive view of its role in antitrust, anti-competitiveness enforcement. So supposed to see an uptick there. I think at the CFPB, you're going to see a full reset of their enforcement because that one in particular was a popular target of the prior administration, and I think we're really going to see a ramp up there. One interesting agency I really think is the CFTC. It'd be interesting to see where they go. In 2019, they made a policy announcement that hey, we're going to dip our toe into the anti-corruption waters as well when it involves commodities trading. And then in 2020 December, we saw Vital, the CFTC was involved. I'm interested, and certainly clients who are affected were warning them to see where that goes, because I don't think there's any expectation that the Biden administration would move away from that stance. And so, if anything, we're looking to see more involvement of the CFTC in corruption related investigations.
So, is there any sort of general guidance you're giving clients other than be vigilant, documentation, perhaps internal oversight on matters, more matters, or how do you really help counsel a client with what you know at this point?
It really depends. One of the things we've been suggesting is if you believe, as we do, that these agencies are kind of doing a reset from the last 4 years and saying, all right, let's start over, let's reprioritize, then maybe it makes sense for the company to do the same. And so, have a training session, sit down, hey, let's do a reset on what our our obligations are, what our expectations are with respect to compliance. I don't expect that many of my clients have gotten lazy over the last 4 years or less vigilant, but it's sometimes helpful when it presents a helpful opportunity, right? When you have the enforcers kind of doing their own reset to take the opportunity yourself and say, all right, let's kind of start fresh, kind of do a full refresher course on what our obligations are. Let's take a fresh look at what our controls are. Are they working? Do we have the right documentation in place in anticipation of this pickup in enforcement?
There was an article this week on the FCPA blog, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the author, but he talked about what is risk-based training, and it seemed to me you've just articulated that. The risks have changed, so perhaps now it's time, and it's not we're in a new geographic market or competitors or customers or sanctions, but really with government oversight, and that could be a changed risk. And so that would be, as you said, an appropriate time to come in and reemphasize it. Do you or the firm, do you really act to maybe train the trainers? So you might train the corporate legal department or a compliance department, and then they may fan out throughout the organization and give training to those high-risk employees?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things we've been doing a lot recently, Tom, is talking to the executive teams and the corporate legal departments about these emerging risks and how we expect enforcement to change over the next 4 years. So to help them do exactly what you just described, let's kind of do a reset on our risk assessment here and find out where the risks are. And the follow on to that is often, hey, if we're going to train this specific group of employees on these risks, what topics do we need to cover? And sometimes it goes as far as, can you provide us some materials to help us make sure that the training is effective, or make sure we're covering the right topic areas. Or, if you are a generalist in a corporate legal department or even a compliance department, you might not necessarily have, know the ins and outs of the CFPB mandate and the regulations. And so, it's helpful sometimes to go to a firm like ours, and we can provide, the specific details that employees need to be trained on.
I'd like to change the focus, if I could, maybe to your experience over the past year in terms of any investigations you either led or been involved with at the firm. Did the pandemic change the way you did investigations? Obviously, you didn't travel overseas, or at least I hope you didn't. And if you did, please don't tell me. But how did you find the experience of the pandemic from the kind of day-to-day work that a white-collar practitioner does over the past year?
It's really interesting. I was talking with some colleagues about this recently. I think when the pandemic first started, we all just held our breath and waited. We had a bunch of investigations that we just said, "Hey, let's hold off." Everybody, I think, had that blissful ignorance that in 4 weeks we'll be back in the office and back to normal. And it probably took a couple months, I think, on our side to say, okay, we got to come up with another solution, because we can't some of these things are time sensitive. Even if they're not time sensitive, it's now clear that this is not ending right away. And so we have to find a way to move forward. And so, as you said, you come up with solutions. We came up with, you do the Zoom interviews or whatever platform is going to work best. And I think for the most part, it worked well. Sharing documents wasn't as seamless as it would be in person. It's, I think, much more difficult to establish a rapport with the witness you're interviewing over video. To kind of test credibility, it's much more difficult. I think there's more of a fatigue factor doing video interviews. I pre-pandemic, I've done 6-8 hour interviews, with breaks obviously, and finished. And it's a long day, but been fine. When you hit the 2 hour mark over video, you really notice the witness kind of eyes start to wander. It's really, there's a fatigue involved that's a little bit different. And so all of that is a challenge. I also think, often one of the advantages of being on site is the potential for sort of the side conversations, right? During a break, what a witness might say or what, somebody else at the company might say to sort of help you along, and you miss all of that. At the same time, and as I was discussing recently with colleagues, there have been some advantages to it. Obviously, not traveling is an advantage to my wife and my family, but just in terms of being able to sequence the interviews in exactly the way you want to, where you're not constrained by geography. So if you have an investigation that's covering maybe multiple locations, right? In order to do it efficiently, we would go site by site, kind of cover everybody at each site. When you're doing it remotely, you can sort of jump around. So maybe it makes sense to first speak to a salesperson in location X, and then a manager in location Y, and move back and forth. That was nice. Also, follow-up interviews is much simpler, right? Rather than having to get back on a plane and go back to the location to follow up, it's much easier to sort of jump on another call. So, there's some pluses and minuses there. Other parts of investigations, as you might expect, Tom, sort of stayed very similar. For the most part, this is not universally true, but for the most part, the background research that we often do as part of an investigation was desktop type research anyway. So that stayed the same. The document review, again, for the most part, stayed the same. That depending on blocking statutes and other data privacy concerns, that has caused some challenges where people had to be on site to review documents. But we've mostly found our way around that. I know that we are anxious as a group to get back on the ground to do investigations and counseling. Frankly, there's something missing. Not having sort of the personal interaction. But one of the positives coming out of this is being able to add in virtual interviews as just an investigative tool mixed in with the in-person interviews. I think it's going to be really useful going forward. I really do. I think whether that's, doing a video scoping interviews to start an investigation, or as I mentioned, follow-up interviews, right? Maybe you go on site, and if there's follow-ups, you can do them by video. Kind of adding that into the investigation mix, I think is going to help with efficiencies. It's going to help with effectiveness, and also ultimately, I think, lead to more thorough investigations.
Do you find, or that's not the right phrase, is there really this the dam about to burst basically for investigations that need to be done in person or interviews in person that you've had to hold off on in the last year, so that when it's safe to travel internationally, or at least to some countries, you and the team are really going to be off to the races again?
I think, at least for us and my team, we have managed now. We've stopped holding our breath and have managed to do most of the investigative work that we've had to do in this environment. So we don't have a huge backlog of the truly sensitive interviews that we feel like we have to be in person for. Having said that, I do expect, and I've talked to some overseas clients about this, that there have been some investigations that clients have because they couldn't bring in outside counsel to really do it and to travel, have been trying to manage on their own, maybe with just supervision or advice from counsel, where we're going to get to a point probably coming up as soon as travel restrictions ease. There's going to be a bit of burst of activity to say, hey, you know what? As a nail in the coffin to this investigation, we really need you to meet with person X, or we really need you to go and visit this office just so we can put this issue to bed, or get your sign off before we put this investigation to bed. And I think there'll probably be a time sensitivity to those. So we are, as things open up kind of country by country, expecting sort of, I guess, multiple bursts of activity. But I think we're fortunate enough, at least where we are, to have accomplished a lot of what we needed to accomplish already in this virtual setting.
I'd like to change the focus to the board of directors, because one of the concepts, maybe two concepts coming out of the pandemic. The first was one of the most prescient observations I heard was by a gentleman from the United Kingdom who said, we used to have disaster recovery, then we moved to business continuity, now we have business as usual. And when you overlay that with a new or different set of risks that arose during the pandemic, social justice, diversity and inclusion, state election, voter suppression laws, just whatever you might want to name it. In the context of ESG, and the prior administration was pretty antithetical to ESG. But when I see and hear ESG, what I see and hear, Mike, is it's just risk. And it's a variety of risks. It can be anti-corruption risk. It can be trade sanction risk. It can be the risk of the diversity of your workforce. And I was wondering, are you starting to have those discussions with boards about either a broader set of risks, or it's really just risk, and how do you assess it and then manage it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it has changed so much over the last 13 months. And I will expand board discussions to include sort of senior executive discussions, because it's very similar. When the amount of I would say pressure and tension and worry from senior executives and boards is unusual right now, given where we are with the economy. Right, many companies are doing really well, and so typically when that happens, a lot of the everybody's happy-go-lucky in the executive room, the C-suite. But we're seeing a lot of worry about all of these issues that you've just mentioned. It seems like there's just more and more risk everywhere you turn, whether it's ESG risk, corruption risk. Part of the worry comes from just not knowing what's coming next, I think. Part of it is there's a sense, even if as the CEO you were never going on the ground to look at corruption issues, et cetera, the fact that we just people have been remote and not been able to sort of get out and sort of be with employees, it creates a lot of unknowns and a lot of uneasiness about what's actually happening. So we're sort of seeing that a lot from clients. It seems like there's an uptick in requests for presentations on what are the risks, because they seem to be constantly changing. ESG, corruption risks. How is it going to be affected by the new administration? There's just you when you lay on top of, it's just issue on top of issue, right? You've got the pandemic, which is ongoing, and the economic uncertainty that comes with that. You have all of the social unrest. You have the change of administration. All of these things laid together have really, it's become very hard to define what companies' risks are and to really hone in on where they should be focused. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot from senior management and boards, is help us get a better understanding of where our risks are and how do we address them.
Look, we focused most of this podcast on the domestic scene, both regulatory, legal, and oversight. But I'd now like to change our focus a little bit to international. Are there any countries or regions that you and your team are watching more carefully, or that you're getting more questions on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we're always on the lookout for the next Brazil, right? 10 years ago, actually, it might be longer than that now. The idea that Brazil would have become a hub of anti-corruption activity and enforcement, including by the Brazilians themselves, just didn't seem that lucky. And so where's the next spot going to be? One place we're looking is China. China for years now has had their anti-corruption push, and that's really focused on Chinese officials. There have been plenty of opportunities for China to prosecute multinationals for activity in China. As a matter of fact, it's surprising it hasn't happened yet, because you've got these agreements, the DPAs, NPAs in the U.S., where companies have basically admitted to bribing Chinese officials. So you would think it would be easy for China to take action. They haven't yet. There's, I think, the reasons for that are probably incredibly complicated. It could cover 4 or 5 other podcasts. But one of the areas we're really keeping an eye on is, as the sort of economic tension between China and the Western world, the U.S. in particular, continues to play out, and the U.S. continues to focus in on enforcement against Chinese companies, where's going to be the counterpoint for China? And I think one of the pieces of low-hanging fruit is anti-corruption enforcement against U.S. and Western companies for activity in China. And so I think it's really possible you could see that in the next year or two. And then, we're keeping an eye on Latin America in general. I think if we're looking for a candidate to be the next Brazil, it's Latin America is a good place. The international investment there is pretty intense, and you've got places like Ecuador, Peru, and Chile that seem to be politically set up in a place where there is political pressure to crack down on enforcement and an appetite to do that in a way that won't discourage investment in the country, but will really sort of enforce the rule of law there. So those are some really focus areas for us, China and places in Latin America.
Well, Mike, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but this has just been a fascinating exploration of not only where we've been, but more importantly, where we may be going. So I look forward to maybe hooking up with you this summer and seeing what Q2 brought us.
Yeah, it's always fun. And I think between now and then, things will have changed again. So it'll be fun to talk in a few months.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. We have a great new show on the Compliance Podcast Network called Mo Forecast, which is a podcast of the law firm of Morrison & Forster, hosted by James Koukios. Check that out on the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, in the month of April on The Compliance Life, I'm featuring Jonathan Kellerman, partner at Stone Turner. A fascinating career in healthcare compliance, culminating in the CCO chair at Allergan before he moved over to Stone Turner. So check out The Compliance Life on the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode of the award-winning FCPA Compliance Report.